It's a great pleasure to be back, and I'd like to thank the law faculty and especially Ben and John Humphreys for inviting me back and also for making me an adjunct. So I've changed the title slightly to make it a little bit broader, and it's got a few more sort of interesting tidbits, but I will discuss responsibility and criminality towards the sort of second half. So the main topic that I wanted to discuss tonight, and that intersects heavily with what we've been doing in Oxford for the last 5 years or so through the Centre for Neuroethics, is how can knowledge about moral decision-making from the biological and neurosciences, which you might call moral science, be used ethically to improve legal process, moral decision-making and conformity to the law. So just to give you the perspective, we've been studying the way in which people make moral decisions and the factors that affect them making those decisions, the so-called science of morality or moral science. And I've written a little bit in relationship to the law, and I'll discuss that, but I think it has profound implications for the law. So many of our laws were formed hundreds of years ago in essentially a pre-scientific period where we really understood very little from the scientific perspective about human decision-making and human nature. And it was also dominated by a Christian ethic tradition. But today, the importance of Christian ethics is less than it was 200 years ago, and we're starting to know a lot more about the nature of human beings as decision-makers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that science. It's still in its infancy, this what you might call cognitive science of human decision-making, but it's certainly providing suggestive results that the picture that we have of human beings is really out of touch with reality. And I personally think that it's an exciting time to be in law, because I think there's going to need to be a legal revolution as this sort of science of moral decision-making and indeed the development of a secular ethical perspective both progress, and we'll really need to have radical legal reform. I'm not going to discuss that in great detail today. I want to just give you some suggestive results of the way in which these advances in science, particularly biological and neuroscience, are starting to affect how we might think about the law and criminal behaviour. So 2 important developments in the last decade suggest that we can rethink the way in which we approach the law and legal processes. The first development is the dramatic advance in our understanding of moral psychology, its evolutionary origin, psychological structure and neural basis. And the second development is the growing use of biomedical means to improve not only physical ability, mood and cognition, but also the possibility of influencing moral behaviour through the use of biomedical interventions. So this human enhancement project is most often discussed in connection with either cognitive enhancement or physical enhancement, so-called doping in sport. But of course, any feature of human behaviour that has a cause in our brain has the capacity to be improved, including our moral behaviour. And 2012, I produced a book with OUP with my colleague Ingemar Persson arguing that this is the most important scientific project that we could undertake today because, for several reasons, the human species is unfit for the kind of world it's created for itself. But I won't go into that very controversial argument here. I want to talk about here the prospect of changing people's moral behaviour and so reducing criminal behaviour. The idea of using biomedical means to improve moral behaviour is not new. This is a page from Freeman's notorious book on psychosurgery, Case 121, described as the meanest person in the world. And 11 days after her lobotomy, she was described as giggling a lot. In 1967, A Japanese study reported that lesions to the amygdala can be used to reduce human aggression, and there have been over 1,000 amygdalotomies worldwide just until the year 2000. Another kind of science that was used, was even seriously considered within the penal system in the 50s and 60s, was aversion therapy, so-called shock treatment to treat the morally deviant, such as homosexuals. This was the subject of Anthony Burgess's book A Clockwork Orange, now famous through Stanley Kubrick's film. This described the so-called Ludovico technique for treating criminal psychopaths by inducing an aversion to violence. When people discuss the prospect of using science to reduce criminal behaviour, they have in mind aversion therapy, the Ludovico technique, Clockwork Orange, and frontal lobotomy, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But this science has been steadily progressing, and indeed there are striking indications that we may well be able to use it in a much more scientific and indeed ethical way to influence human behaviour. We generally think of ourselves as rational beings making decisions based on reasoning, weighing carefully the pros and cons. But recent science suggests that this is, at least in significant part, an illusion. Such reasoning appears to be a rare phenomenon. Indeed, most moral decisions are based on immediate intuitions, emotional responses, and gut reactions. Reasoning, even if it comes into the picture, is often used in a post hoc way to rationalise what we already thought was the right decision. So what does shape our moral decisions and our moral psychology if it's not for reason? The first are a range of what might be called extrinsic influences. Some of you may have heard of the psychologist Jonathan Haidt and others who have studied the influence of disgust on moral judgment. A dirty desk or a bitter drink makes people more severe in their judgments and their awarding of punishment. The presence of the image of an eye can make people behave more generously and more honestly. So, for example, if you have, I saw this in the law faculty, they have an honesty box for your coffee and they ask for $1. If you put an image of an eye above the honesty box, more people will put the $1 in. You can even get the same effect with 3 dots resembling a face, but not if you reverse the dots. Now, this is a nice example of just how basic our responses are to the world and how heavily influenced they are by the structure of the situation around us. Closing your eyes polarises moral judgment and increases honesty. Laughter has the opposite effect, making people more morally permissive or indifferent. It also makes people more likely to endorse the so-called utilitarian decision of sacrificing one person to save 5 others. A recent study looked at the cognitive effects of severe sleep deprivation in US soldiers who didn't sleep for over 50 hours. And again, it found significant moral effects. It increased the willingness of people to make those so-called utilitarian judgments, and it decreased emotional intelligence. Caffeine didn't change these effects. In what I think the most striking ecological study of the limitations of human moral decision-making, a group of researchers in Israel studied real-life legal decisions. They looked at the willingness of judges to offer parole according to the time of day of the case. And they found this striking pattern that over many judges and over many decisions, there was a strongly significant statistical correlation with how likely the judge was to offer parole varied inversely from the time they last ate. So essentially, the further away your case was from the last food break, the less likely you were to get parole. And this was a statistically significant difference. Now, this is a very simple example of how our biology, in this case our physiology, can affect our moral decisions. You would hope that the decision to offer parole would be based on the facts of the case and the responsibility of the defendant or the prisoner or various other factors. But in fact, it's significantly affected by the physiology of the human animal who's making that decision. Now, this doesn't answer the ethical question of whether judges were too lenient early after a food break or too severe at the end. You would need some independent way of trying to evaluate the justice of such decisions. But once you set that point, you can then start to look at how to manipulate physiology in order to achieve that kind of decision. This is a simple example of how changing people's biology could affect something as significant as whether you're in jail or out of jail. Now, there are various ways in which science has shown that you can affect people's moral decisions besides, for example, food or starvation. One is direct neural stimulation. Deep brain stimulation has been widely used to improve depression and movement disorders. This is inserting a needle deep in the brain to stimulate strategically parts of the brain. It was even used in one Italian study to reduce aggression in two intellectually disabled children. Dirk de Ridder, who's now in Otago, has said that this kind of therapy could be used for moral reconditioning. But fortunately, we don't need to use invasive techniques like the insertion of needles into the brain or psychosurgery to affect the brain today. There are so-called non-invasive methods such as magnetic stimulation. If you magnetically stimulate an area of the brain, you can either inhibit or excite that area. As an example of how this can be used not only to treat disease but to affect moral behaviour, researchers zap the side part of the brain, an area which is known to be involved in ascribing mental states to other people, so trying to read other people's mind and intentions. So when they zap this area, people who were zapped judged attempts to harm that were unsuccessful but intentional as being significantly less wrong. Now you might say, well, that's, interesting, but what's the relevance? It shows in principle that even sophisticated judgments like whether we take somebody to be responsible for what they've done or whether we judge what they've done to be wrong is a function, of course, of activity in our brain that's capable of being modified. Another striking study could be said to be an example of immoral enhancement. One group of researchers used a different non-invasive technique which we've been using in Oxford, transcranial direct current stimulation, essentially giving a light electrical current over a part of the brain. You can buy these devices on the internet now. They're marketed for a variety of conditions without good scientific evidence, but in certain situations they've been shown to increase the ability of people to learn. So it increases numeracy, increases motor skills. You could use this to increase performance in sports. It essentially strategically excites slightly an area of the brain, making it more easy for those neurons to fire. What these researchers did was use it to increase people's ability to lie and reduce their guilt associated with lying. Now again, this sounds like a trivial thing, and in fact I think there was a recent study of this that just came out, another sort of replication of this sort of work. If you can do this for lying, you can do it for truth-telling. Essentially, everything that matters about our lives, all our hopes, dreams, expectations, whether we're a liar or not, and how good we are at lying, how intelligent, how musical, etc., is all the result of activity in our brain. It doesn't matter its origin, it goes through the final common pathway of brain activity. And that brain activity is capable of being modified. There are various drugs that influence moral decision-making now. One of these is the antidepressant Prozac or Zoloft. I'm not sure what it's called here in Australia. The selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor group. It's a widely used antidepressant. It makes people more averse to harming single individuals, so making them less likely to sacrifice one to save the five. It makes people more cooperative in cooperative games. It makes them more willing to forgive. So it has quite subtle effects on various aspects of moral behaviour. Now, many millions of people are on these drugs every day, and some of them are on juries and some of them are judges. These drugs will be affecting their moral decisions. Another drug you may have heard, or a substance, neurohormone you may have heard of, is oxytocin. It's a naturally occurring hormone like the neurotransmitter serotonin. It's released naturally during breastfeeding or after sexual intercourse or touching or massage. You can take it through the nose, intranasally. When you do this, it increases trust and cooperation between members of your own group. But in fact, increases your willingness to sacrifice other people from other groups. So it essentially promotes bonding within groups and increases out-group derogation. So in one Dutch study, Dutch subjects who took oxytocin were less willing to sacrifice people with Dutch names, but there was no effect on people who had Arab or German names. Now, testosterone is another familiar hormone that has, of course, various effects on moral decision-making. As you would expect, higher levels make people more utilitarian. They also predict the day's profitability of a trader on a strong market and reduces empathy, reduces trust. Essentially, it increases the concern people have for social status. This is a substance that varies from individual to individual and again is capable of being modified. So let me finish by a survey from one of our DPhil students, Sylvia Turbeck. She found that all of us, and this is a well-known finding, but all of us are implicitly racially biased, so at a subconscious level. So people are programmed to detect outgroups at a subconscious level. And this is picked up by a test called the implicit association test. She found that if you give people the drug propranolol, which is a drug that blocks the beta receptors, it's used in the treatment of high blood pressure and anxiety, you reduce this implicit racial bias. So you reduce the negative associations people have to different race faces on this very well-established test. So it's clear that biomedical means can influence moral decision-making, but their effects are often at present highly contextual. What is important is that many of the things which we take today and the situations that we're in will shape our moral judgments. So this isn't mere science fiction. These influences are already acting on us. So many people have this quite naive view that human morality and human moral psychology is some kind of virgin forest, and that talking about intervening is like bulldozing a forest, and they fear that this will have the kind of effects you see in Clockwork Orange. But there are vast individual differences in the level of, say, serotonin or testosterone or oxytocin that we have. All of us are different. So there are already vast differences in the way in which we make moral decisions. And most importantly, our moral psychology and our nature as animals is not made in the image of God, but is the result of largely blind evolutionary processes, and it would make little sense from an evolutionary perspective to think that either everyone is equal or indeed that our moral psychology and dispositions are perfectly attuned to the sorts of dilemmas that we face. So if you're worried about these kind of brute, irrational influences on moral behaviour, undermining what is genuinely moral, this is true of much existing behaviour. And also, although people don't currently intentionally take drugs to make themselves morally better, they do take drugs which have moral effects. So even those who reject the very kind of perfectionistic program of trying to make people morally perfect, should be able to endorse the negative project of minimising these distorting effects. So now let me turn to the law and how using this is just a sketch, it's really just a story, how these sorts of advances could be used in the law to improve either legal process or people's behaviour. With my colleagues Anders Sandberg and Walter Sinnott-Armstrong, we discussed jurors' performance and memory and the ways in which various factors we know now can interfere with people's ability to remember. Memory is not a photograph, it's a reconstruction, and many factors affect that way in which that reconstruction occurs. There are many cognitive factors which can interfere with the way in which memory is formed and the way in which people such as jurors have to make decisions. And there are various ways in which their decision-making could be enhanced. Even something as simple as note-taking could improve memory, although it's banned in certain jurisdictions. But importantly, there are a wide range of substances today that could have various effects on jurors' performance. And indeed, many of these substances may already be being taken by jurors. So we now are starting to develop a wide range of drugs that affect cognition, and as research into, say, Alzheimer's disease progresses, these substances will become more and more effective and more safe. So there's a question of today, what kind of juror should be sitting on a trial and how could we enhance their performance? Indeed, jurors are already medicated. Many of them are on medications. Many take medication to deal with jury situations and many are on illicit drugs. All of these have important effects. So an important project is to try to understand how this kind of moral science could be applied in these sorts of real-life cases. I want to now get on to this idea of predicting criminal behaviour and how this sort of information should be used. Because I think this is one of the areas where science has already progressed to a stage that is being used in courts, and there are ever more important possibilities. Around 500,000 people a year die of homicide, and most of these are not premeditated. Most of them are impulsive and represent immediately reactionary violence provoked by anger, irritation or threat. Now, there is one genetic, what's called polymorphism or variation, that has been shown to be associated with impulsive violence, called the monoamine oxidase genetic variation. Now, this variation goes back, I think, to the early 90s or late 80s, where a geneticist called Hans Brunner in the Netherlands was brought a family by, I think, the maternal grandfather or grandmother, who said there is something wrong, the maternal grandmother, there's something wrong with our family, because half of the men are professionals, engineers, doctors, and the other half are in prison for rape, arson, exhibitionism, and other various violent outbursts. And this aggressive behaviour was usually triggered by anger and was often out of proportion. For example, one affected male tried to run over his boss with a car at a sheltered workshop where he was employed after having been told that his work was not up to par. None of the women were affected, and there was a low but normal IQ in many of the men. So Hans Brunner drew up a family tree, and it followed a classic, what's called X-linked pattern of inheritance, which means women carry one copy of the gene and men either get it or they don't, because they only have one X chromosome. So that's why half were affected and half were normal. And when he looked at the genome of these affected men, he found what's called a nonsense mutation. That is, the gene for monoamine oxidase A was completely absent. Now, monoamine oxidase A is a protein in the brain which metabolises neurotransmitter substances in the brain. So in these men who were violent criminals, this gene was absent and this protein was absent. And indeed, when he looked at the urine, there was various supporting evidence that these neurotransmitters were disturbed as a result of this genetic mutation. Now, after this case, there were many attempts to use the so-called genetic defence in violent crimes. So many people came forward saying, well, my client did it because he has the MAO-A mutation, and no other family or no other individual was found to have this so-called nonsense mutation, that is, no activity of MAO-A. So all of these genetic defences failed. However, a group of researchers in New Zealand actually found a much more common variation of this gene. They found that this gene for MAO-A comes in two versions: the low activity variant, which about a third of people have, and the high activity variant, which about 2/3 of people have. And neither of these variants are predictive of aggression. But what they found in a study of more than 1,000 New Zealand boys was that if you divided people into the high and low variant, and you also looked at variations in early childhood care, abuse, neglect, if you had children who had been abused or neglected who also had the low activity variant, they were far more likely to be future violent impulsive criminals and have impulse control disorder. If they had the high activity variant and abuse, there was no significant effect. And likewise, if they had the low activity variant and a normal childhood, again, there was no increased rate of criminal behaviour. So the combination of the low activity disposition together with a certain social environment involving maltreatment was highly predictive of future criminal behaviour. Now, the knowledge that this gene might lead to future criminal behaviour is very important, because it means that those with the gene are much more vulnerable to adverse environments. This is an example of a biomarker, what's called a biomarker, a marker in our biology that predicts but doesn't determine future behaviour. And there are three ways in a recent paper with Matt Baum from Harvard we described you could use these sorts of biomarkers. You can use them for the benefit of the person, you can use them for the benefit of other people, or you can use them for the benefit of other people while also harming the person who has the biomarker, and that's obviously the most controversial area of use. So first of all, how could you use knowledge like this, knowing whether someone has MAO high or low, for the benefit of the person? Well, first of all, you can use it in the allocation of resources. It would be a wonderful thing if all children were protected from abuse, maltreatment or neglect. But given that resources are limited, this science would predict it's much more important to funnel resources towards children who have the low activity variant. And indeed, you may have a lower threshold to separate a child from abusive parents with a low activity variant, or indeed you may employ surveillance or other ways of monitoring behaviour if you have the low activity variant. You may also provide special resources for people who are at higher risk. So, for example, mindfulness training or cognitive behavioural therapy and omega-3 fatty acids found in fish oil have both been found to have some effect on improving impulsive behaviour. So again, this might be something that could be offered to those at highest risk. But most controversially, this has been used in the law to mitigate responsibility. So in two cases that I know of, one in Italy, it was used to reduce the sentence, and in one US case, it was used to reduce the charge from murder to manslaughter. Now, this is an example of how the courts are starting to use knowledge of biology to make decisions about punishment. Ben talked about responsibility. Now, one of the problems is that although we have some data that shows that there is some effect between the gene and the environment, the data is very imprecise. So, in the case of Bayut in Italy, Bayut was a man who was dressing as a woman, teased in the street. He came back several hours later and stabbed somebody he thought was one of the people teasing him and killed him, but in fact it wasn't. That wasn't one of the people who was teasing him. And his counsel used this monoamine oxidase low finding to argue that because he'd been uprooted from Algeria and suffered stress as a result of having to move to Italy, that this was a case of diminished responsibility. But the data associated with the Mayo A case is of very early childhood abuse and immediately impulsive reactive violence. So Bayut didn't clearly fit that pattern. So what you have is a body of science that is suggestive without clear articulation of what it is to be responsible and without precise ways of linking that to various facts of a case. So again, in Waldrop's case, he was clearly abused, sexually abused as a child, I think, and then also he did immediately react. So the case was at least strong in Waldrop's case. How could you use this information for the benefit of others without harming people with the biomarker? Well, you could use it in genetic selection. So, for example, you can test embryos today for monoamine oxidase, high or low, as a part of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and IVF. So, in fact, couples could decide they wanted to have children who have the high activity variant because there doesn't appear to be any downside. Now, this kind of genetic selection is banned in many states of Australia and is also banned by the NHMRC, but it's an example in the ways in which parents could start to use this sort of information to make procreative choices, either for the benefit, of their family, having a child who isn't prone to impulsive violence, or the benefit of society. So in the case of Brunner's family, it would be very easy to even just do sex selection and select female embryos without even doing any sophisticated genetic testing in order to have children who don't have the nonsense mutation or males who don't have the nonsense mutation. The most controversial area of using this kind of knowledge is to benefit society when it imposes some kind of harm on the person with the biomarker. So many people fear this kind of biological testing and using that information will lead to things like unjust surveillance, over-investigation, preventative detention, harsher sentencing. So the father of this kind of so-called science was Cesare Lombroso in Italy, who said that born criminals should be punished not in proportion to the magnitude of their crimes, but rather according to the threat of future crime. So Lombroso this was in, I think, the 1800s, had a way of measuring people's skull as a way of predicting whether they would be violent criminals or various facial features. And this was clearly largely nonsense science. In another example of the sort of dark past of bioprediction, voluntary sterilisations were used both in Nazi Germany but also in the United States and Europe, even until the 1970s in the case of Sweden, for people thought to be at risk of having children who would be criminals. Now, these are clearly unethical uses of, in Lombroso's case, non-science, but even in the case where the science is sound, these are unethical and exaggerated uses of the science. But there are many more ethical ways in which this kind of science can be used. And as a general rule, provided that we choose a minimally liberty-restricting method that is likely to be efficacious, that will lead to a reduction in a significantly undesired social behaviour, then we can attempt to use that intervention. The best example of this is genetic testing for thalassemia in Cyprus. Thalassemia is a disorder which is recessively inherited. So if you have 2 copies of the mutation, you have thalassemia major, a very significant blood disorder resulting in death in late adolescence. In Cyprus, this gene is extremely common. And there was essentially an epidemic of thalassemia in Cyprus in the 1980s, where 50% of the drug budget was going to treating thalassemia and 100% of the blood supply. And this was just increasing exponentially. A genetic test became available that could test pregnancies to see whether the fetus was affected with thalassemia major. So the response of the church in this case was not to require that people have testing and have abortions if they had pregnancies with thalassemia, but simply to require that couples wanting to get married both have carrier testing. So if they found out that they were both carriers, there'd be a 1 in 4 chance their child would have thalassemia. So the church actually infringed their liberty. It said, if you want to get married, now you have to have a thalassemia carrier test. But this was, I think, quite a reasonable restriction of their liberty. They could still choose to have a pregnancy, they could still choose to have a child with thalassemia, but as human nature would have it, because of these people's experience with thalassemia, nearly 100% of them who found out that they were carriers chose to go on and have testing of the pregnancy and chose to terminate pregnancy. So the rates of thalassemia dropped radically. This was a minimally liberty-restricting intervention with massive social effects. It's an example of how you can use a degree of compulsion and knowledge of biology to bring about socially beneficial outcomes. I'm going to finish in a second. I just want to give you 2 examples of real-life moral enhancement that are currently being employed within the law. The first is improving impulse control in people who have attention deficit disorder, and the second is modifying the sex drive of paedophiles. Now, attention deficit disorder is essentially an impulse control disorder. 10% of children in countries like Australia, New Zealand, UK, United States are on Ritalin to improve impulse control. Reason for that is if you can't control your impulses, you can't make plans for the future. You can't learn, you can't delay gratification. So it has extremely beneficial effects in terms of education and life opportunity. But what was also found in a study a couple of years ago in Sweden was that if you take adult patients with attention deficit disorder and place them on Ritalin, you reduce the rate of violent reoffence in men by 32% and women by 41%. So that's a profound reduction in the rate of violent crime. If I said to you I've got an educational program that would reduce crime by 30%, you'd say, well, let's implement it tomorrow. But there is such an intervention, it's called Ritalin, in the case of adults with attention deficit disorder. So I'm going to argue briefly that I think this sort of thing should be not only offered, but should be compulsory. The other example of current moral enhancement, crude though it is chemical castration of paedophiles. 9 states in the United States allow for the administration of female hormones to sex offenders in order to reduce sex drive. This is a way of controlling behaviour. In some cases it's optional, in other cases it's mandated as a condition of release, and in other cases it's just mandated. It also occurs in Europe, and indeed several Australian states have toyed with the idea of employing this kind of behavioural control for at least recurrent paedophiles. Now, this kind of moral enhancement has drawn the sort of concern that A Clockwork Orange created. So the bioethicist in the United Kingdom, John Harris, has said, in response to this sort of project, there are substantial issues of liberty which could conceivably be threatened by measures that make the freedom to do immoral things impossible. Michael Sandel, the famous US bioethicist, says, to imagine that our moral capacities could be deepened in a pill would cause unimaginable damage to everything we understand about human moral character. So both of these philosophers or bioethicists should, in principle, be opposed to the kind of manipulation that's being employed in the case of paedophiles. Harris claims that what's essential to being a human person is that we must have the freedom to fall. That is, we must be free to make choices for the good but also for the bad. And to enhance people in a way that would make it impossible for them to behave immorally would be fundamentally dehumanising and undermine everything that's important about humans, as Sandel said. So a question to ask is, does moral enhancement necessarily restrict freedom? Giving people substances to make them more empathetic, for example, psychopaths or those with Asperger's syndrome or people who are autistic, would not necessarily make them less free. It would make them more like women, who are more empathetic than men. And nobody believes that women are somehow not free because they're, on average, more empathetic. So making people more virtuous needn't necessarily undermine their freedom. Pass over these next two examples. Involuntarily chemically castrating somebody would reduce their freedom to make a decision around castration. Of course, if you offered them the choice, so one of the debates in this area is, should these sorts of interventions that affect people's behaviour be optional and consented to, or should they be involuntary? If they're optional, then they don't clearly affect people's freedom, because they're an illustration of what might be called a pre-commitment contract, where you know that you're going to behave badly in the future and you take steps now to voluntarily restrict that. So, for example, if I'm an alcoholic, I say to my wife, I want to go out for dinner, but not somewhere that's serving alcohol. So this would be a way in which I restrict my future freedom in a way to achieve my goal. So if people with attention deficit disorder or paedophiles agree to take Ritalin as a way of improving their moral behaviour, this wouldn't undermine freedom in any important way. The only way in which these sorts of interventions would undermine freedom in the way that Sandel and Harris worry is if they're given involuntarily. Now, it's important to realise that we do restrict people's freedom all the time in order to promote their own interests, in order to promote their own autonomy through education, training, and so on. And in some cases, we might restrain people's freedom if the benefits were great enough. Because, of course, if people do commit crimes, they will in the future lose their freedom. And if we're only affecting an isolated area of their lives, it may be justifiable to restrain their freedom. In the case of Ritalin, not only is it good for society, but it's good for the person. It both promotes their well-being, their future options, their socio-economic success, and it enables them to plan and have life plans that involve the further future. In both of these cases, it's important to recognise that freedom is only one value. If these kinds of interventions benefit the potential criminals themselves, as in the case of Ritalin, there's a strong argument for making their use compulsory. I'll finish with this thought that one basic moral principle, or what you might call minimum morality, is a duty of easy rescue. When the cost of doing something to someone is small and the benefit to others is very large, they ought to do that thing. So Peter Singer has this famous example of the small child who's crawled into a pond and is drowning a 2-year-old child. He says, all you have to do is get your shoes wet. Nonetheless, you ought to rescue the child. So as an extension of that, when the harm to someone else in society is large and unjust, a person can be compelled to either act in a certain way or to refrain from acting in a certain way when the cost to that person is small. So in the case of Ritalin and perhaps even hormonal castration, the costs to the individual, at least in the case of Ritalin, are arguably non-existent. These are some of the ways in which science is starting to impact both on judicial decision-making and also the way in which we treat those who commit crimes. There are many other ways in which it could be used in various processes, so I haven't discussed the use of magnetic resonance imaging for lie detection, the use of EEG, and so on. This kind of science is exponentially increasing. Already we're starting to see the law beginning to dip its toe in the water of the scientific age. This kind of issue is going to just get more and more significant as we develop more and more fine-grained ways of affecting people's behaviour. The challenge, I believe, is to think now about the principles that should govern the use of science within the law before it starts to be used in an unprincipled and unjustified way. Thank you. Thanks, John. That was tremendous. We've got some time for questions. Yep.
Have you compared, or has there been comparisons with neurofeedback and Ritalin and impulsive behaviour, and what's the outcome there?
Yeah, there's a book that I recommend by a Cambridge psychologist called Ames, I think. It's called An Anatomy of Violence. It's a very readable, and it's a story about psychopaths. And this guy has spent his life studying psychopaths. And it's a very, very good treatment of impulsive violence and psychopathy. And he discusses there 3 ways of affecting impulsive violence. Ritalin, neurofeedback, as you mentioned. Neurofeedback is being able to see the electrical activity on a computer screen of the surface of your brain and using voluntary behavioural control to modify that electrical activity. So you learn essentially by looking at the way in which your brain is functioning. You can also do this with fMRI. So these sorts of neurofeedback mechanisms. It's done typically with EEG. So Ritalin, neurofeedback, and also cognitive behavioural therapy. So this mindfulness training. So all 3 of these are being trialled and have effects on impulsivity. And the question is, well, shouldn't we be using cognitive behavioural therapy, for example, in order to teach people to be able to sort of exert more self-control? And my answer to that is it just depends on the risks and benefits of each of these interventions. We shouldn't presume that an environmental or psychological intervention is always going to be more effective than a biological one. And neurofeedback is in between the two. It's both biological plus sort of social. So I think, again, as a general rule, there are 3 ways to achieve an outcome. So say your outcome is to reduce violent crime. There's 4 ways. You can change the natural environment, you can change the social environment, you can change psychology, or you can change biology. All of those can have an effect, and this is a good example where there are a range of options. I think we need science just to tell us which is going to best achieve that goal and what its risks are going to be. So I think we don't have a clear answer, is my understanding of the science. Yep.
So, Julian, given that we can now explain so much of people's moral decision-making depending on the basis of their genes, and it's likely in the future that we'll be able to explain even more of their behaviours through these genes, do you think that the idea of retribution in the criminal justice system makes sense? The idea of moral responsibility?
Yeah, look, I think that this is, as I said, always these talks, we've got lots of facts there and little sort of tidbits, but it's really just a story. It's like a bedtime story. It's not a kind of transmission of the sort of complete state of the world. I think this science is extremely early. I think that actually it's probably going to be a decade before we really get at least a reasonable understanding. One of the most famous researchers in free will is a guy called Patrick Haggard in London, and he thinks we just don't have free will at all. And he thinks retribution is completely, we're going to have to completely change the legal system to just adopt a completely different sort of consequentialist approach to punishment. I don't know if that's correct. I think my reading of this sort of literature is that we are much less free than we believe ourselves to be. Whether there is no freedom at all, I don't really want to embrace that, but I think that we're going to have to rethink exactly as these cases of Bayut and Waldrop and so on are starting to rethink how responsible people really are and how much retribution is justified. So, I think that we just don't know, because that's why I think it's a good time for people like you to be in law, because it'll start to unfold. I was mentioning this case, I think, to Ben, my favourite example of this, of just how primitive the law is and why it's just, the kind of, this sort of circus can't go on forever, is this woman, I think in 2011, was found guilty of conspiring to murder her husband. Her name was Teresa Lewis in Virginia. And she was sentenced to death because they have capital punishment in Virginia. And her counsel sort of said, oh, no, look, she's intellectually disabled. And if you're intellectually disabled, your sentence is commuted to life. So they did the testing, the IQ testing. And to be fair, this wasn't the only reason they made the judgment. But essentially, they found her IQ was 72 and the cutoff is 70. So she was executed. Now, the definition of intellectual disability is a statistical one, 2 standard deviations below the mean. So, it's not clear to me what account of moral responsibility they were using in that decision, and how having an IQ of 72 rather than sort of 69 tracked onto being responsible. There's just no story. It's essentially as if science will answer for us, what we ought to do in these situations. But when you scratch below the surface, you see that actually the kind of concepts of responsibility are so thin, and their connection with scientific facts is so tenuous that, in one case you can be alive, in another case you can be dead. And I mean, that can't be the sort of final point of law. It's got to do better than that. So I just hope I never happen to get in front of a court or taken in front of police. I just think it's a terrifying prospect to think that with people with all of these limitations, who are in these positions, making decisions, that your life is going to be sort of in their hands. So I don't know how it's going to unfold, but I think there's a lot. The same with ethics. I think that we are just at the beginning. Like people think, like Francis Fukuyama had this really stupid book called The End of History. When the Berlin Wall, he said, democracy has shown itself to be the sort of final pinnacle of human existence, and now everything is fine. Berlin's wall's fallen down. And, nothing today could be further from the truth. And I think we just don't realise how, much there is still to go.
You were saying, I guess, those interventions like Ritalin or antigen-reducing medication like education happening in a principled way in the law. And at the moment, for example, Adjunct is administered to a lot of people with intellectual impairment outside of the law, just by their relatives or friends or guardians. Can you explain what type of principled approach should be done with that type of medication?
Well, again, one of the problems is we don't have a kind of unified secular ethic that you can sort of immediately apply to that and say, oh yeah, it's right or it's wrong. But I always think a good place to start is utilitarianism. So utilitarianism says you should make the choice which has the greatest good to the greatest number. So you should do what has the best outcome. So if you're not doing that, if you're not taking that course of action, somebody is worse off because of what you've chosen to do. Now, you can have good reasons for that. You might say, well, it's important to protect people's privacy, or it's important to protect people's freedom, even if this has costs. But the pressure is to find that kind of justification. So in these kinds of cases, the first thing I want to know is, what are the benefits to that person what are the harms to that person, what are the benefits to other people, and what are the harms to other people. Start with that. And then argue, and then say, well, which course of action, giving the drug or not giving the drug, is going to have the best effects? I don't know. You need to know the facts of these sorts of cases. And then are there any other relevant competing principles like, respect for autonomy or whatever? So one that I am familiar with is sterilisation of people with intellectual disability. Or an even more extreme case is this so-called ACHLR case. I don't know if you've heard of this. So there was a number of years ago, there was a big debate around this so-called ACHLR treatment. A girl was born with very severe what's called static encephalopathy. So basically there was just a thin layer of brain. So she was conscious, but basically would always have the intellectual capacity of a 3-month-old infant. Okay, so she was conscious, and she was 6, 7 years old, and then 8 years old, and was going to enter puberty, but had the cognitive abilities of a 3-month-old baby, and was being cared for by a family in a home and so on. And the family said, when the doctors wanted to perform a sterilisation and also give hormonal treatment to stop her growing any bigger, so she would never enter puberty. So essentially to block puberty and block further growth, and also remove her breast buds so that her breasts wouldn't grow. And her family said, if she becomes a full-grown woman, we won't be able to lift her and take her to family events, and as we do now, we won't be able to involve her in family life. And so the procedure was done. And they said it was, the best for her, because overall she would be able to be integrated into family life. Opponents said no, they should be provided with resources to use hoists, and this is not, this is an invasion of her, rights as a human being against human dignity, to essentially stop a person developing normally. It was inflicting, a disease on her. In my view, it turns on actually what's going to be best for her. I mean, you might say the parents were doing it for their own benefit, but if indeed it was going to lead to her having a better quality of life, in that case, I think there are arguments to justify at least parts of that ACHLR procedure. But that's probably the most extreme example of this sort of thing that I know. But I don't know what I think each case you have to consider the sort of details of it. But that procedure has been stopped, and it's just not done now. And I think as a result, some people are institutionalised who would have been cared for at home. I think it's a real question whether that's a good thing.
Sorry, may I have to bring some?
No, that's all right.
Thank you very much, Julian. Tremendous presentation.